Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of the virtual book talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture, or FIBAC, at the American Antiquarian Society. I'm Kevin Wisniewski. I'm the Director of Book History and Digital Initiatives here at the American Antiquarian Society, and I am joined today by my friend and AAS colleague, Amanda Kondik. Today's event features University of Wisconsin-Madison professor Brigitte Fielder, and it is part of a series of monthly book talks dedicated to the history and future of the book. Each month, we invite an author of a recently published monograph or digital equivalent to share that work and to answer a few questions from those in attendance. Now, before asking Brigitte to join us today, I do have a few short introductory points. First, for those unfamiliar with AAS, the Society was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. Today, we are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts, devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of this nation before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. Second, we are using the Zoom webinar platform for today's talk. And I'd like to turn to my colleague Amanda now, who will give a quick overview of that platform and some of its features. Amanda?
Thanks, Kevin, and welcome everyone. So before we do get started, I do have a few notes on the mechanics of our Zoom webinar format. So for the Q&A portion of this program, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions for Brigitte during or after her presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you will also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon, and we'll get to these questions at the end of the program. The chat function is also open, so feel free to send your comments to all attendees and panelists. And throughout the presentation, I'll also be posting additional information and links relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC, and you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. And if you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. And finally, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this program. So for those who could not attend or for those who would like to rewatch it, we will be posting it on our YouTube page. So thanks, everyone. And Kevin, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. If you like what you see here as well, I would encourage each of you to sign up to our mailing list. Pardon me. Amanda will make that available in the chat as well. In just a couple of weeks, we will be announcing our spring 2021 schedule. I'm really excited about it, and I look forward to seeing all of you then. Now, I'd like to introduce today's guest. Brigitte, if you would like to unmute yourself and start your video. Brigitte Fielder is associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and teaching interests include early African-American literature, 19th century US literature, race, gender, and sexuality studies, children's literature and childhood studies, and human-animal studies. She is, with Jonathan Senshin, co-editor of Against a Sharp White Background, Infrastructures of African-American Print. Brigitte was also a 2011-2012 Chavik Fellow here, and she currently serves as co-coordinator with Alex Black of Just Teach One African-American Print, a project sponsored by AAS. She is currently working on a new project investigating racialized human-animal relationships in the long 19th century. Now, her first book, the subject of today's talk, Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America, was published by Duke University Press this October. And Amanda will share a link to the publisher's page for those interested in ordering a copy if you have not yet done so. So with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome Brigitte Fielder.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to make sure I can do this here. Okay, so thanks so very much to the American Antiquarian Society and the program in the history of the book and American culture, all of the good people at AAS, particularly Kevin and Amanda, for the work that you've done to have me here today. I want to thank also the authors who preceded me in this series for setting such excellent examples this year. Those are great videos. I've been rewatching some of them. And there are too many other people to thank as I think about this book, so I won't rehash my acknowledgments, but I do want to say that I'm very, very grateful to everybody who has Zoomed in today at the end of this very difficult year. Virtual events are still very odd to me, but I'm heartened by the conversation in the chat at these events. I want to give a shout out to any graduate students who are Zooming in, especially to first generation college students like myself. And just one other shout out to my parents, Sue Ann and Stephen Fielder, who are in the audience today, tuning in from New York State. Among the many, many things that they contributed to this project were some of the photographs for this book, which they went and took for me for my 5th chapter on Mary Jemison. So thanks very much, Mommy and Daddy. If you look at the cover of my book, you'll recognize some of these images, I think, of Ellen and William Craft. In Ellen and William Craft's disguise and escape from slavery, we observe the extent to which race operates not only in racialized bodies, but in the relationships between them. Because Ellen could pass for white and her husband could not, her relationship to him needed to be refigured in order to affect her passing. Specifically, Ellen's whiteness depends upon her distance from any assumption of sexual kinship with William. The racializing effects of this relationship are such that Ellen can only become white by disguising herself as William's enslaver, not as his spouse. Here we see how race intersects not only with class and gender and ability, but also with sexuality. Ellen's disguise as white becomes more effective if she presents herself as belonging to a certain class, and as she removes herself from having to write and to have conversation by virtue of her passing as disabled. But her gendered passing upsets a possible search for a man and a woman traveling together. And also through this regendering, we see relations of heterosexuality refigured. By assuming the role of William's enslaver, Ellen performs a reimagined relationship to her husband, one in which her sexual relationship to him is obscured. A white woman would seem out of place traveling with a Black man whom she did not own in the antebellum United States. But in a world of racial intermixing and ambiguity, this out of placeness would also signal questions about this apparently white woman's own race. The couple's disguise then is not only Ellen's dress and her class, ability, or gender presentation, but Ellen and William's relationship to one another. On my book's cover, we see these portraits as well as those of some of the Craft's children. Represented alone, Ellen Craft might easily be read as a white woman, but viewed in these relations to her more obviously visibly Black family members, she becomes more legible as a mixed-race Black woman, even though individually she may have been able to pass as white. Although Blackness is not always visible, these images of the Craft family visualize one way in which race is relative. Race is not simply conveyed upon Ellen Craft in a top-down genealogy passed from parents to children, but is also constructed via these other kinship relationships with her husband and children in relation to whom her own race is read. Unpacking the constructions of race as relative is this book's main project. I mean the term relative to refer both to the production of race and relation, as constructed not within individual bodies, but in the relationships between them, and to its production through kinship ties, though not necessarily in exclusively biological or heteronormative genealogies of racial descent. Relative races presents an alternative theory of how race is constructed. Rather than tracing downward genealogies by which race is transmitted from parents to children, my readings of 19th century literature show how race can follow other directions. The process of race making not only transfers race from a genealogical past to a future descendants, but differently, through non-biological relations of adoption, horizontal relations of sexual kinship, and backwards genealogies of racial reflection from children to parents, or circular relations by which race is constructed and reconstructed. These genealogies might best be understood as creating a queer temporality of racialization. Race is still relative in these alternative genealogies, as the figure I discussed from racial identifications that affect how they construe kinship relations and vice versa. This theory of racialization effectively reimagines the relationship between race and family. It also reimagines the spaces of racialization as happening simply within individual bodies or through racial self-articulation, but also through familial recognition. Race is produced and reproduced in relation, in the connections between bodies, in domestic spaces, through literary genre, and in practices of racialized reading and naming. The theory of racial formation I present in this book acknowledges both the understanding of race making as a taxonomic project of comparison and the importance of kinship relations for assigning bodies to racialized groups. Different processes of racialization may work in tandem with or even against one another, and their potential conflict reveals the nature of race as constructed, as historically comprehensible, though not entirely predictable, as complex, as mythos, and as entirely real in its import and impact on racialized bodies and relations of kinship and power. Passed through genealogies of inheritance across generations of history, race is not essential to this inheritance, but constructed by it. Here we see how race itself does not produce, but is produced by societal relations in various historical settings. Race is constructed, though this fact does not make it any less real. Expanding the scale of comprehending race beyond the individual shows us how race is relational rather than only generational. Race is relational or relative in that it is not simply embodied by an individual, but constructed as racialized bodies are placed into relation with or comparison to one another. Race is also relative in the sense that it is structured by and through kin relations in the text that I discuss. Because race isn't simply inherited, relatives may be assigned to different races. Mixed race people are racialized in ways that ignore some relations and prioritize others. And even non-biological relatives may still inform one another's racialization. These differently directional genealogies might be understood as creating a queer temporality of racialization. I use the term queer to describe race's genealogies of construction and reconstruction, processes of racialization that cannot be explained solely via heteropatriarchal models of inheritance. Just as they don't always follow normative chronologies, neither are genealogies of interracial kinship necessarily patrilineal. The notion of hypodescent, what we call the one-drop rule for designating someone with any amount of Black ancestry as Black, regardless of other racial genealogies, does not follow this patrilineal model. Hypodescent is perhaps the dominant framework in which race's queer genealogies operate in the United States. The notorious law of the Virginia colony that determined how racialized slavery was inherited by declaring that the child follows the condition of their mother is another. Just as mother's enslaved status alone determined her child's, only one parent's identification as Black is sufficient to racialize children as such. In its most ironic sense, we might also regard hypodescent as a queer genealogy of race that oddly aligns with Black feminism in its resistance to patriarchal and even heteronormative notions of race's biological transfer. My understanding of hypodescent resists the anti-Blackness inherent in assumptions that inherited Blackness is only or even necessarily oppressive. A Black feminist reading of hypodescent is clearest in the chapter that I'll discuss today, in anti-passing literature in which Black mothers are prioritized over white fathers. Even where we might purport to trace race through a biological mother and a father, the genealogy of racialization refuses this heteronormative structure in US law and custom, prioritizing or excluding certain parental genealogies in favor of others. The result is not necessarily what Hortense Spillers calls kinlessness, or the loss of the mother described by Saidiya Hartman, but in the texts I discuss, hypodescent results in a prioritization of Black and Native mothers over other kin in narratives of mixed-race women and mixed-race children whose racialization both uses and resists tropes of white womanhood in order to resist white supremacy. My discussion of racialization is premised on the understanding that race-making has as much to do with the construction of whiteness as it does with other kinds of racial construction. Discussions of white womanhood in particular in the American 19th century have primarily emphasized notions of essentialized biological, genealogically inherited race that I critique. Because the figure of the white woman has become central to narratives of normative genealogical racial reproduction, I give particular attention to texts that upset this rhetoric of white womanhood in 19th century American literary culture. The relative races of the historical figure and literary characters that I discuss here are therefore complexly organized around the power of interracial kinship relations to racialize white women in particular. My focus on white women takes up a thread of American studies established by scholars such as Amy Kaplan, Linda Kerber, Karen Sanchez-Epler, and Shirley Samuels that positions the white woman as a definitive site for racial construction in the 19th century US popular and literary culture. As literal reproducers of whiteness, white women have most often been discussed as figures whose primary function is to keep the racial other outside the domestic spaces of the home, family, and nation. Relative races reads the rhetoric of white womanhood when interracial kinship relations come into play. When whiteness fails, or sometimes refuses to preserve or perpetuate white reproduction despite these genetic ties, race's queer genealogies become visible. A variety of Black feminists and queer theorists have also informed my readings of race and relationality, including those of Joyce Green McDonald, Kimberly Wallace Sanders, Patricia Hill Collins, Roderick Ferguson, and Kathy Cohen. I also draw upon the work of theorists who reconceptualize time's lineage, particularly in queer theorizations of time, by writers like Lee Edelman, Dana Luciano, Peter Coviello, Jose Munoz, Elizabeth Freeman, and Mark Rifkin. Scholarship by Katie Childs, Sharon Patricia Holland, Christina Sharp, and Alexis Pauline Gumbs is also temporal, asking readers to reimagine race's trajectories, calling up race's past lives while looking towards contemporary understandings of race's meaning and efficacy. The most pressing critiques of race also dovetail with and are inextricable from critiques of kinship, as can be seen in the work of scholars such as Hortense Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, Nancy Bentley, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, and Holly Jackson. My project is also invested in realizing the theoretical in the literary. As scholars from Barbara Christian to Derek Spires have shown, literary forms also do theoretical work. Toni Morrison's novels and dramatic works have greatly influenced my understanding of the literary as theoretical, and some of these figure in my discussion of these 19th century texts. I'm most interested in how creative writers theorize and continue to theorize race, sexuality, and kinship in ways that resonated and continue to resonate with contemporary discussions of race's importance. Regarding race and relation allows us to observe the different scales at which race is made, simultaneously racializing at the level of body, home, and nation, and creating race's circular teleologies of reproduction and reconstruction. My book is organized so as to trace race through the expanding scales of body, family, and nation under the headings romance, reproduction, and residency. These expanding scales for racialization also indicate race's ever-expanding stakes. I begin with a sort of urtext for white racist anxieties about interracial kinship. The image of Othello and Desdemona that we see in the background of Henry Clay's illustration shows us how white women are positioned as especially susceptible to receiving race. just as Othello's blackface makeup in 19th century US theatrical productions rubs off on Desdemona, making her begrimed and black in these stage plays. This racialization has implications also for a future of white reproduction that extends to the white supremacist nation. While white supremacy is dependent upon exclusions that define white people only in relation to people who are not white, it is also dependent upon the ability of whiteness to reproduce itself. We see this also in the example of Mary King, the daughter of white abolitionists in William Allen's narrative. King and Allen's friends compared her to Eliza of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, reading her as a mixed-race heroine by virtue of her interracial family's fugitivity. Here we see that racialization is very much like literary genre. Both are best read in context, in comparisons that become recognizable, but may depart from a dominant pattern. Throughout this book, I read racialization's generic relational underpinnings within their socio-historical and literary contexts. This becomes apparent in readings of race in the Captivity narrative, a genre which informs how race is read in both Allen's narrative and in Mary Jemison's, which I discuss in my final section. Jemison, though born white, was adopted by a Seneca family and thereby became a Seneca woman, a racialization that becomes apparent in her relationships to her native family members and to the land of which she would ultimately be dispossessed by the US government. The continued conflation of indigeneity and race in popular academic discussions of racialization has had lasting implications, as discussed by scholars such as Kimberly Tallbear, Jean O'Brien, and other Native scholars, and adds an additional problem to be unpacked in discussing US histories of racial formation. I don't wish to conflate racialization and indigeneity here, but instead, I mean to recognize what Jody Bird calls, quote, the entanglement of colonization and racialization. By recognizing how racialization cannot be divorced from matters of land and sovereignty. Reading race in domestic spaces of multiple scales also extends to understandings of the racialized nation. My readings of national racial reconstruction show how the most profound anxieties about amalgamation lie in larger implications for the racially construed nation. Here we see the nation both as continued teleology of race's genealogical futures and as an expansionist space in which race is continually produced and reproduced. White women are implicated in these anxieties, often steeling themselves against the kinds of queer racialization and re-racialization that I've discussed throughout this project. I'll turn the rest of my discussion today to the middle of my book, the second section that treats the familial scale of racialization, reading racialization as intergenerational by reading how race's queer genealogies work upon mixed-race heroines. The most iconic figure of enslaved Black womanhood is a figure of what Hortense Spillers calls kinlessness, a sort of childless mother, the mammy, a woman forced to mother the white free children of her enslaver, but with no legal parental claim to her own. While popular images of the mammy displace Black children and Black matrilineal in favor of relations of enslavement, and while the violence of slavery disrupted patterns of Black kinship, the fullness of Black matrilineal is another persistent trope. As enslaved women were wrenched from their children, they also clung to them, sometimes managing to wrench their kin from the hands of their oppressors. We might recall the powerful image of Sojourner Truth as she walks away from her enslaver's house in pursuit of her son. He had been illegally sold out of the state, although New York's gradual emancipation would have granted his freedom. Her 1850 narrative tells us that, quote, what Isabel heard that her son had been sold south, she immediately started on foot and alone to find the man who had thus dared, in the face of all law, human and divine, to sell her child out of the state, and if possible, to bring him to account for the deed. Even though the law was on her side, it is remarkable that Truth was successful in getting her son returned to her. Here we see an enactment of the iconic power of Black matrilineal and the persistence of racial trajectories that would extend into new generations. A counter to Truth's role as a caregiver and wet nurse to the children of her enslavers, her account of Black motherhood extends beyond the legal battle won to retrieve her son into her larger racial legacy. Truth's matrilineal kinship is multi-generational. In this photograph taken in 1863, she holds a picture not of her son, but her grandson, James Caldwell, who served as a member of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in the Civil War. This generational skipping over of Truth's own children in this portrait suggests another queer genealogy of the childless mother trope, as even the effectually childless enslaved mother might still reproduce Black lineages beyond her scope. This shows how, despite kinlessness or the loss of one's mother, though a real and affectively valid experience of anti-Black violence, extending towards larger generational scales reveals a kind of racial prescience. In this way, we might understand that kinlessness looks backwards towards loss, but also ironically suggests its own future-leaning counter of racial kinfulness. The phenomenon of kinfulness that I introduce in this section describes not an absence, but the fullness of kinship and its racializing powers. This phenomenon works simultaneously alongside, but counter to the violence of kinlessness, extending our understanding of the relationship between kinship, race, and reproduction. I here build upon discourses of sexuality and racial reproduction to begin expanding outward towards racialization's broader scope. The experience of the enslaved mother cannot be fully explained by the state of kinlessness that Spillers uses to describe the state of enslaved African-American families. When notions of belonging manifest in the triumph of property over kinship, the enslaved mother and child might also be characterized by an excess of kinship, kinfulness rather than kinlessness. While Spillers uses kinlessness to articulate the prevention of enslaved people from full participation in kinship relations, I introduce this alternative concept in order to attend also to the additional content of racialized kinship. Nancy Bentley notes this excessive non-familial content of the condition, writing that, quote, kinlessness is a sign of social death, but also a source of interminable life, an unbounded future increase detached from any enforceable claims or obligations that belong to heirs. I speak here to this unbounded future increase of not only enslaved motherhood, but also racialized motherhood more generally. Future increase does not necessarily produce kin, but it does produce race. The figure of the enslaved mother thereby creates slippages between reproductive and racially productive futurity. Speaking to not only individual racialization, but also racial production and reproduction, I mean to refer to the racialized concept of content of kinship, to kinship as racially pregnant in excess of more than interpersonal relations, but bearing the weight of larger racializing scales. Kinfulness's excess is twofold. First, it describes the baggage attached to kinship through the matrilineal inheritances of slavery. Not simply an inheritance of racialization, these genealogical baggage is extra, possibly unnecessary and even unwanted, as we see in the case of slavery's matrilineal inheritance. It shows how racialization spills into kinship, interfering with other genealogical relationships. I describe slavery's inheritance as excessive in order to momentarily disaggregate kinship from this legal status, to highlight this inheritance as imposition, even as it was naturalized by white racist ideologies, to denaturalize slavery as it was produced by virtue of this relation. Second, kinfulness refers to the simple numerical excess of relations available for racialization. Racial hypodescent itself is a manifestation of kinfulness, as the usual mode of racial construction for mixed-race people necessarily ignores some kinship relations while prioritizing others. Kinfulness also speaks to the concerns or anxieties that come to bear on kinship choices. What kinship relations might be produced by sexual couplings or created in domestic spaces of family, and which kinship relations are recognized or denied in genealogies that also racialize. Non-normative kinship sometimes follows lineages of choice rather than biology, and racial kinship sometimes separates lineages of descent and racialization. At stake in the stories of racially mixed characters discussed in this chapter is the production of race itself, which results from the processes of acknowledging and rejecting certain kinship relations. In these texts, the directionality of race flows towards the production of Blackness. Here we see how race is reproduced in two ways. First, through the queer unilinear, matrilineal genealogies and Hypodescent. And second, through Blackness's multi-generational persistence, even when threatened with racial destruction by the rendering of enslaved families or individuals passing as white, and even in the genocide of anti-Black racism. The most foundational critique of kinship at the heart of this project involves recognizing a tendency away from white patrilineal genealogies in the text that I read. Writing on mixed-race Black heroines in African-American literature, Gabrielle Forman has critiqued how some scholars, quote, overemphasis on patrilineal descent and identification with and projection of white desire continually revisits the paternal and the patriarchal, the phallic and juridical law of the white father. Such readings fail to recognize the ways that 19th century African-American women writers in particular centered motherhood in their narratives and theorizations of racialization. My discussion of racist matrilineal non-heteronormative genealogies build upon the work of scholars and African-American women writers such as Forman, Frances Smith Foster, Carla Peterson, and Anne Seal, who recognized the complex ways such writers theorized race, particularly with regard to mixed-race Black people. The importance of Black women to these theorizations of race, both as writers and thinkers who understood the complex connections between race, sexuality, and kinship, and its important reproducers of race, cannot be overstated. Even when I read white women's inability or unwillingness to reproduce whiteness, Black women's racial reproduction looms as a counter to white racial reproduction and the reproduction of white supremacy. Black women's reproduction, even when forced under conditions of enslavement, has been met with Black feminist resistance to these white norms. Such resistance is not unlike race's occasional resistance to normative genealogies for reproducing whiteness. The complex intertwining of race, sexuality, and kinship is evident in the study of 19th century African-American women and follows threads that also become visible in the work of Black queer studies by scholars such as Roderick Ferguson, Kathy Cohen, DeRay Scott, and Robert Reed Farr. Ferguson explains that, quote, African-American culture has historically been deemed contrary to the norms of heterosexuality and patriarchy. So too, I would add, has non-white racialization, the theorization of which can be seen in Frances Harper's fiction. Like Harper's 1869 serialized novel, Minnie's Sacrifice, her 1893 novel, Iola Leroy, is what Forman calls an anti-passing narrative, depicting characters who discover and ultimately identify with their Black genealogies. Recognizing Iola Leroy as an anti-passing narrative is essential for understanding how Harper positions these texts in conversation with abolitionist literatures of the antebellum period and plantation nostalgic fiction of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The anti-passing genre is also important for understanding what may look like an irony of racialization in the ways that Harper's protagonists reconstruct race. If the phenomenon of passing itself is a kind of re-racialization, anti-passing seems to risk adhering to essentialist notions of race. The crux of anti-passing literature is the assumption that passing is possible, and that for ambiguously raced bodies, racial identification becomes a choice. The anti-passing narrative is a narrative of racial hypodescent, as Harper's characters' Blackness emerges as a function of recovering their African-American relations. In Iola Leroy, racial identification here becomes not simply a choice of identification, but one of kinship, as its main character's Blackness depends ultimately upon who they embrace and who they reject as family. The origin story that Harper here revises, in which a child who has been raised as white discovers their Black ancestry only in adulthood, and at that moment she herself becomes a victim rather than the beneficiary of racial oppression, here upsets the bedrock notions of racial essentialism and genealogical inheritance. Harper's emphasis on motherhood highlights the mother-child relationship as primary to this novel's aspirations for racial determinacy and uplift. Foreman notes the prominence of mothers in early African-American women's writing, explaining that Harper and others wrote protagonists who attended to Black women's agency in part by, quote, recuperating an economically, legally viable and racially inflected motherhood. Black mothers are not kinless in Harper's novel, but here are the reproducers of shared kinship ties and shared racialization. The author's motherhood even foregrounded in Harper's dedication to the novel Harper's dedication to the novel to her daughter, Mary. It reads, "To my daughter, Mary E. Harper, this book is lovingly dedicated." This centering of the child-mother relation in Iola Leroy is emphatic throughout the novel, in both Iola's search for her own mother following the Civil War and her maternal uncle Robert's similar search for his mother, Iola's grandmother. Iola Leroy does not merely foreground maternal relationships, but prioritizes them among the narrative's excesses of kinship relations. This prioritization illustrates the queer workings of hypodescent, as racial inheritance does not follow dual heteronormative genealogies, but single, maternal ones. Despite Harper's focus on biological relationships, biology is not the crux of the novel's framing of kinship so much as racial identification is. Mixed-race Black characters align themselves racially and politically with certain biological family members while simultaneously rejecting kinship with others. Like Iola, enslaved or formerly enslaved characters in the novel come to ignore kinship ties, like those between enslavers and enslaved people, and to articulate kinship instead along lines of shared racial identification, rather than biological genealogy alone. Throughout the novel, race is thereby produced and reproduced, not simply through biological genealogies, but according to which kinship relations are acknowledged and which are rejected or forgotten. That her hope of reconciliation with her mother has colored all my life, Iola says, is a telling metaphor for the rest of the story, in which the relationship binds maternal kinship and racial reproduction. In this way, the novel exhibits matrilineal Black kinship rather than the plantation patriarchy as having the social efficacy that Hortense Spillers and others have shown is denied under enslavement. Harper's centering of Black motherhood further reveals the ersatz kinship relations between enslaver and enslaved, distinguishing emphatically between the figure of the Black mother and the Black mammy. In what must have appeared to Harper's post-Reconstruction readers as a familiar defense of slavery, the visibly white and still unknowing Iola Leroy's initial anti-abolitionism is based on the picture of her own father as a kind enslaver. Now removed to the North for her education, in true plantation nostalgia form, Iola recalls her youth and the close relations between the families of white enslavers and the enslaved people on the plantation where she was raised. Iola claims, "I love my mammy as much as I do my own mother, and I believe she loves us, just as if we were her own children." Once Iola has learned the truth of her biological mother's, and hence her own Blackness, though, this claim is exposed as dubious. Much of the rest of Iola's story focuses on her persistent search for and relation with her own biological mother. This is accompanied by her corresponding forgetting of Ma'am Liza, whom Iola never seeks out, and the fond memory of whom almost disappears from the story. The only other time readers are reminded of Ma'am Liza is when Aunt Linda's motherly manner, quote, seemed to recall the bright sunshiny days when Iola used to nestle in Ma'am Liza's arms in her own happy home. While this may seem like a lapse in racial solidarity, it is also a refusal to sentimentalize the mammy-child relation, or to elevate this to the status of kinship. The mammy is therefore revealed as ersatz kin, as Iola's initial pretense about her commitment to Ma'am Liza proves false. Given Iola's previous declaration of affection for her mammy, choosing to seek out one woman and not the other seems at least somewhat arbitrary. Importantly, the dialect-speaking, illiterate Aunt Linda does not remind Iola of her biological mother. This makes Iola's later reminiscence of her mammy rather curious amid the novel's prioritization of biological kinship ties, grandmothers, mothers, uncles, and brothers, rather than the larger support system of non-biologically related but similarly raced and enslaved people. Only immediate biological kin constitute Iola's familial obligations. We here remember that the relationship Iola has with her mammy was that of a white child of enslavers, and not as an enslaved Black person. Unlike many of her white contemporaries, Harper does not idealize the figure of the mammy or sentimentalize even this mammy-child relationship. The ersatz kinship of relations of plantation slavery are a red herring of sorts in the novel, as kinship between an enslaving family and the enslaved people it holds captive are continually revealed as false. Iola's re-racialization fails to retroactively change her racialized relation to her mammy. Not all Black people are kin to one another in this novel, even as race is determined in relative terms. Even as the novel directs us towards racial uplift, kinship is both exceptional and foundational. While shared racial identification and kinship are not simply to be conflated, kinship and mothers are the rock upon which racial identification is built. Although shared racial identification does not necessarily produce relatives, Black mothers reproduce race. This racial reproduction allows racial uplift to become possible despite the violence that chattel slavery has done to enslaved families. Iola Leroy maps the persistence of the enslaved family by placing the mother at its center and tracing the genealogies of racialization to new generations of relatives. After the Civil War, we find members of the novel's rendered families in a religious camp meeting. Quote, "In that meeting were the remnants of broken families, mothers who had been separated from their children before the war, husbands who had not met their wives for years." Iola Leroy's most poignant depiction of these separations is perhaps that one between an enslaved mother and child. Alongside the various tales of grown children longing for their lost mothers, the scene of initial parting is presented by an older, dark-skinned, emancipated woman named Harriet, who we learn is Robert's mother and Iola and Harry's maternal grandmother. Harriet gives witness to this event in what is both one of the most familiar and one of the most heart-wrenching scenes of Harper's novel, in which a formerly enslaved woman recounts her separation from her children and her wish for a reunion with them. I have here how this appears in the text, but I'm not going to attempt to really read the dialect to you. "Brethren and sisters, it were a dreadful time when I was torn away from my poor little children. When my little girl took hold of my dress and begged me to let her go with me and I couldn't do it, it most broke my heart. I had a little boy, and when my missus sold me, she kept him. Many is the time I've stole away at night and seen that child and slept with him in my arms till most day. By and by, the people I've lived with got hard up for money, and they sold me one way and my poor little gal the other, and I never laid eyes on my poor children since then. But I's praying for one thing, and I believes I get it, and that's that I may see my children before I die." What is heart-wrenching about this scene is not its exceptionality, but its familiarity. What is familiar is not only Harriet's painful memory of separation, but also her prayer to be reunited with her children. Just as scenes of separated and sold families were prominent in antebellum anti-slavery writing, Black newspapers reflected their readers' hopes for post-slavery familial restoration. One of many such examples, published in the Christian Recorder in 1886, reads, "Information wanted of my mother, Jane Ross. She belonged to a man named Captain David Taylor, who lived on Eastern Shore, Maryland. She was sold away down south. Any information of her would be greatly received by her daughter, Minnie Blake, formerly Minnie Ross, 206 Dean Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." People searching for lost kin published information wanted advertisements like this one in postbellum Black newspapers. Readers of newspapers like the Christian Recorder, in which Harper published both poetry and fiction, would have likely connected this scene of Harriet's history and hope to the larger post-war landscape in which Black people like Minnie Ross sought out lost kin, illustrating the violence slavery had enacted upon Black family and also kinship's importance to Black people and communities. Harper's image of Black motherhood revises that of the slave mother trope to show not only the denial of kinship, but the aftermath of slavery in which the hope, even unfulfilled, of finding lost kin is restored. Information wanted advertisements and Harper's camp meeting scene show how, even in the physical absence of kin, articulations of kinship persist. In light of this persistence, it is no surprise perhaps that Harper's novel focuses on matrilineal as multi-generational. There is no separating the intertwining of motherhood and racial reproduction in the text, but the racial reproduction necessary for uplift extends towards generational futurity. In addition to theories of racial hypodescent, the impetus for reproducing race has long been associated with the policing of women's reproductive bodies. As the novel shifts Iola's initial narrative of privileged white middle-class womanhood to the race women of Black educational uplift, Harper's anti-passing politics positions racialized matrilineal as foundational for the deliberate, radical racial reproduction of Blackness. Iola's and Harry's Black identification extends to their anti-passing politics and to their deliberate reproduction of Black kin. Both siblings marry Black people and recognize the generational implications of these decisions. As Iola situates herself firmly within her Black family, they are also part of a larger Black community. Taken within the larger context of racial uplift in which Harper sets her novel, we see the role of Black mother poised not simply as a matriarchal kinship relation, but as a community leader. Reading the Black mother within this context of racial uplift necessitates extending this figure's role from the scale of the familial to the national. Upon hearing Iola's paper on the education of mothers at a parlor meeting, Reverend Eustace remarks of, quote, the great need of the race is enlightened mothers, who with the help of enlightened fathers, we imagine, can help to raise a generation of children who will function as Black citizens of the American nation. This additional layer of Harper's uplift narrative extends familial relations and responsibilities beyond the scale of the nuclear family to a larger community of racialized kinship. This scalar shift is both spatial and temporal. The production of Black family is projected forward to produce Black futures. And I'll leave you today with just one more picture from the book, which we can see on the spine here, of Charlie Kraft, who is one of William and Ellen Kraft's grandchildren.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. As Amanda has noted at the beginning of our talk today, the Q&A is open. I'm watching all of the accolades come in through the chat, Bridget. Lots of applause. I would like to give everybody a moment to weigh in and think about what questions they'd like to add to that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. While we're waiting for those questions to arrive, Bridget, at the very beginning of the talk today, you acknowledged the graduate students who were in attendance, and I'd like to double down on that and acknowledge all of them. There are many folks graduate students who attend these programs. And one of the questions I often receive from those working on graduate degrees is about research and the writing process. I think it's always very helpful and validating for them and for all of us, for that matter, to hear about authors' experiences. And so with that, I'd kind of like to get started on that sort of a question. Could you tell us a little bit more about the research and writing process of this book? For example, how your time, how did your time working with archival collections enlighten, further complicate, or in general help shape this work?
Thanks very much for that question. I mean, in many ways, my work with various archival collections drove the directions that the project took. So at the beginning of my talk, you saw just a couple of images of Othello and Desdemona from the 19th century US. A lot of that research was from the ephemera collections at AAS, these boxes of Civil War cartoons and things, that I went through and started to notice things. And so it wasn't that I had an idea of how, say, the urtext of Othello and Desdemona as a narrative of race and racialization, how that stood in the 19th century US, but that was something that I only really kind of discovered by the process of noticing where this comes up over and over and over again, like seeing that picture, that clay picture, and seeing the Othello and the Desdemona in the background, and making those connections to people's descriptions of stage versions of Othello. A lot of those, I read some annals at AAS also in which that describe, because Othello was performed in blackface makeup, actors talk about how that blackface makeup comes off onto white women playing Desdemona. And and so these kind of odd accounts that come out of the archive. The other thing too about this project is that the process of being in the archive for me very much has not been a process of isolation, and that comes in part to the, I think, way that research at AAS often happens in the space of the reading room, and so it's very much, I think, also about not just reading a bunch of stuff and noticing what you see there, but also of reading alongside any number of other people who are also reading things. And those other people include librarians, they include other researchers, people working on things that have nothing to do with what you're working on. And in many ways, it's only in conversation with other people that I have found myself able to articulate and make sense of this project. And that takes a number of forms. One of those forms is the kind of academic generosity, often about the archive itself, that I've experienced. People who are willing to send people things that they think they will like. A lot of some of the things that I've written about are things that, like, someone told me about. Oh, I know what you work on, and this is something for you. That's a form of generosity that I think we need to really replicate and continue, especially in virtual spaces, because we don't have access to kind of be in the same spaces with everyone while we're working in the same way that we did. But that's been important to me, and also talking through how these things fit together. So it's not just a process of collecting, but trying to make sense of the things that I saw was something that I can only do in conversation, actual conversation with other people. And so shout out to all the Cornell grads of my era and of other eras who have have had to listen to me talk about this stuff over and over and over in various venues, in our text chat, and over many, many years, because it's through those conversations, oftentimes just casual conversations, and not conversations that are happening in formal spaces, that my thinking about a thing has changed. Oh, it's not really this, but it's this other thing that I didn't actually write about, but now just spoke in conversation with someone, and I'm able to now put into writing in a different way. And that process has been really, really, really important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's amazing to kind of acknowledge that community. One thing I've noticed just since the beginning of the book talks here, the amazing community of folks that come together, and the amount of generosity and love that is spread here, and especially during these times. Gosh, I just a big thank you. Yeah, again. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I want to actually maybe combine a couple of questions here as a follow-up before I get to those. Writing and that research process really is about decisions, and for all the things that you include in your book, there is so many other things that unfortunately didn't make the final cut. I was wondering, were there specific items or other examples that didn't make the cut of this book that you would have loved to have included? And maybe if I can tack on a second question, your book really covers a lot of ground. I mean, really, you're starting as early as like the mid 18th century at some points, even though it's grounded in the 19th century, and you span all the way until the 1890s, and of course references to today. I'm just wondering if, as kind of like a follow-up question as well, if you noticed in your research and writing the ways in which race-making processes changed or evolved in literature across the 19th century. So two separate questions, but combined.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with the first one. And the one of the things about the other thing about research is that while you're looking at an archive, you find all kinds of things that have nothing to do with what you're doing, but that you also might want to write about. And so, thinking about how and what fits into a project is also, I think, for me, a process of tangential projects that have varying relationships to this project, and that I worked on while writing this, and that ultimately did help me to write this book, even while they didn't kind of make it in. And so, the importance of writing the other thing that's not this thing is something I can't stress enough. I think as it turns, one can come back to a thing with fresh eyes, I think, after you don't look at it for a minute and think about something else. But one of the things that I didn't write about in this book at all, in part because for the wrong reasons, but it worked out, I think, was the woman of color. I want to say 1801. I could be wrong there. Anonymously authored narrative published. It's epistolary. It's published in London, about a woman who travels from Jamaica to England and back again, who's a mixed race Black woman. Is something that I've been thinking about when I was writing about this, and I actually wrote about it in another place. It's a part of an edited collection, and it wasn't really until later that I realized that writing that piece helped me to understand what I was trying to say here about how race is working, and thinking about what relationships between differently racialized people look like in some of these other texts. And so, which isn't to say that things are working exactly in the same way as that text as they are in the ones that I discuss here, but that book could have easily been, I think, part of its own chapter of this project today. We can figure things differently, but allowed me to do different things, I think, that then helped me to get a little bit of clarity on what this book's particular project was. And that was, by way of, in some ways, kind of understanding its scope, and thinking about racialization in like U.S. nation formation in particular, I guess. The second question about changes in how race racialization is understood is an interesting one, I guess, because I think the most kind of obvious place for this are resistances to hypodescent in mixed race identification, which are available in any number of ways, that are kind of have to do with recent shifts, like the ability of mixed race people to indicate more than one race on a U.S. census, for example, is relatively recent. You can't indicate more than one race on in a number of official forms of documentation, as it turns out. I know this because I have a Wisconsin driver's license, and so the absolute inconsistency of how people understand race is one persistent thing, I think, and that travels in a really interesting way from like Enlightenment era racist science, where nobody can agree how many races of people there are, but they're sure white people are the best, to these ways of categorizing and understanding race across different systems, especially when we think about things like numerical data and counting of racialized people, and that's, I think, a kind of interesting connection over time. And so the thing that has stayed the same is the kind of differences in agreement. I think there are important shifts in thinking about Blackness and anti-Blackness in critical mixed race studies, which is still a very, very presentist oriented field. But ideas of how, especially mixed race Black people identify themselves is something that is getting interrogated in ways that I think are different. But the other thing that I see too is that when you stop prioritizing, when you don't only prioritize white authored text, you see different things in that are more specific. So sometimes things that look like progress are only people attending to non-white writers in ways that they hadn't before. But sometimes we can see some of those ideas, especially I could think of like early Black feminist writers expressing many ideas that are resonant to Black feminist discourse in the present. And that is, I think, really, really fascinating.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We have, I think, enough time for a couple of questions here in the Q&A. And as always, I will send Brigitte all of these questions following this talk. So all of these will be saved in some fashion and sent to Brigitte. The first question here asks about the relationship between individual and collective agency at work in racialization, specifically Black motherhood and how Black motherhood becomes constructed and reconstructed. So the question is, could you say a little bit more about how you see affection, especially sentimentally constructed affection, creates and disrupts these choices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, this is a really interesting question. In this moment of Sojourner Sun's misrecognition is, I think, an important and poignant one. I mean, one of these things I think has to do with clearing away this racist pro-slavery myth about Black feeling. That Black people don't feel for family in the same way as other people is this lie that people tell themselves, I guess, to feel better about, the separation of families and this trauma that they're inflicting upon Black people. But Black people kind of consistently, narrate scenes of affect in ways that I think are importantly not only performing affect for a white audience, but that are sometimes doing other kinds of things. And so, I could think about this, in terms of how someone like Harper, narrates these scenes, for people who don't need to be convinced that Black families matter. She's Iola Leroy might have a larger audience than some of her serialized fiction in the Christian Recorder. But I think it would be wrong to understand her as writing only for white people, or maybe even primarily for white people here. But she is playing on a lot of tropes. And so here we have, I think, some ways that not just Black sentimentality, but white sentimentality is reconstructed. So in that scene, when Iola still thinks she's white and she has these thoughts about her mammy, she's playing with the plantation nostalgia genre that gives us certain kinds of sentimentality around Black people that Harper then exposes as total bunk in this way. And so when it comes down to it, we can see, I think, lots of different kinds of affect, both bad faith and good faith affect, I think, that are working throughout that novel in ways that are very deliberately playing on various sentimental forms of literature, sentimental tropes in anti-slavery literature, sentimentality in plantation nostalgia literature, and Harper is just kind of disrupting these for us in a number of ways, and I think that's really interesting.
Great, yeah, thank you. We have another question here. What's been the most helpful to your work to theorize the visual archive as it interacts with print literary texts representing racial kinships?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. What's been most helpful? I mean, I think, you know, in many ways, I've had to think a lot about language for talking about race and the visual markers of race that are so steeped into our language for talking about race that don't always show up in visual representations of mixed race people in particular, or that show up differently in some of the representations that I write about in this project. So I write about these minstrel plays, of Othello produced in the US 19th century, in which everybody's in blackface, including Desdemona. And these aren't things that I've seen because nobody needs to put on these plays ever again. But, kind of trying to think about the absence of the visual in light of the kind of linguistic markers of race and racialization that rely upon visual imagery, even in the absence of having those visual representations, or in visual representations like the picture of Ellen Craft that don't really align with that language that we use as descriptive. Like, if you took Ellen Craft all by herself, you might not know who she is. She looks very much like a 19th century white lady. And could be, I think people's best guess could be other people. And so thinking about those disjunctions has been helpful to me in interrogating, the metaphors for race in color, in appearance, in the notions of race's visuality and visibility. Is disrupted in many of the texts that I'm reading, and so trying to work through and be deliberate about how I think about describing an image, or how I think about what that language means for the imagery that I'm evoking, for things that I'm trying to visualize for readers that don't necessarily see those things, like what these minstrel plays might have looked like.
We have time for one final question, I'm afraid. We could continue this conversation all day, I think, but working on our time limits here. One final question, and that is, what do your findings about constructions of race and kinfulness mean for us today? How does this help us understand race in the 21st century? Well,
I think, in some ways, it calls for us to read texts differently than we might have understood them, and I think to read perhaps certain genres differently when we try to understand. This is in some ways, I think, a function of the kinds of narratives that come to the foreground of slavery, for example. In racialization, as these individualistic accounts or narratives of race that are very personal and individual in their experience, and that's true of 19th century texts as well as of 21st century texts. But to understand people not only individually, but to understand people as operating in families and communities, I think helps us to understand their texts very, very differently. And this is a point that I think is maybe kind of obvious in certain ways, but I don't think it comes out in perhaps the most popular versions of these. So if we were to read somebody like Frederick Douglass's narrative, right, like we have this idea of, bootstrapping, individualism, telling something to read or whatever, but like, you got to think about what Anna Marie Douglas and her family does in order to enact any of this, just to understand how we get this narrative and how he gets free. And this is deliberately obscured in the 45 version of his narrative, for kind of protective reasons. But our tendency towards individualization when we think about texts, especially Black texts, when we think about literary firsts, when we think about Black exceptionality, I think also cause us to tend towards these kind of individualistic readings that then obscure a bigger picture, whether that's how an individual person is racialized in relation to everybody else that they're talking about, or how an individual text might be understood as part of a larger genre that makes it legible in various ways and with which it interacts and works rather than just in a vacuum. I think that helps us to see longer threads and also temporal shifts in different ways. We're not just pinpointing individual moments either, but we have to think of kind of longer historical legacies or even projections into future moments that some of these texts are trying to enact or anticipate or imagine for themselves. And that, I think, has really kind of helped me to just shift how I approach some of this work that I'm reading.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. With that, I would like to thank Brigitte for joining us today. Her talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the upcoming weeks. So I will email you soon regarding that. This is actually the final book talk of the year. So I would like to take an opportunity to thank each of you for attending and really making this such a really successful program. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Please remember to check out future AAS programs and to sign up for the FIBAC mailing list. Again, our spring 2021 schedule is amazing and it will be available in the coming weeks as well. So please check that out. And finally, I know it's still early. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but since I might not see many of you until January, on behalf of myself and everyone here at AAS, I would like to hope that you and your families have a very safe and happy holiday season. So thank you again, Brigitte.
Thank you so much for having me.
And until next time, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.